It's wild, isn't it, to think about how the whole world kind of rearranged itself after World War II. Like, one minute, the US is over here, pretty much keeping to its own side of the map, and then boom, suddenly it's a major player on the global stage.
Right. Total power shift. And, there are a couple of things, big things that really set that whole transformation in motion. We're talking about the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, two huge policies that basically defined the early years of the Cold War.
Absolutely. So that's where we're diving in today. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. We're going to figure out where they came from, how they actually played out in the world, what kind of impact they had, both right away and over the long haul, and why, honestly, they still matter so much today. And we've got some really solid sources here to help us unpack all of this.
Perfect.
All right, so let's set the scene, right? It's 1945. World War II is finally over, but the alliance that defeated the Axis powers is already falling apart.
Yeah, wartime buddies, not so much anymore.
And meanwhile, the Soviet Union is like grabbing up territory in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, Poland, Hungary, Romania, they're all basically becoming Soviet satellites.
Exactly. They're setting up a buffer zone, right? And at the same time, Western Europe is a complete disaster zone. Bombed out cities, industries in ruins, people struggling to survive. Not exactly a stable situation.
Not at all. You've got this huge power vacuum, and somebody's got to fill it.
And that's where the U.S. steps in a big way with the Truman Doctrine in March 1947.
Yep, that was a game changer. And the thing that really kicked it off, the immediate spark, was Britain basically saying, hey, we can't afford to prop up Greece and Turkey anymore. We're tapped out.
Right, because Britain was still recovering from the war themselves.
Totally. And Greece and Turkey were these super strategic spots. I mean, in Greece, you had a full-blown civil war going on between the government and these communist insurgents who were getting a ton of support from, well, their neighbors to the north. Right. And Turkey was under this immense pressure from Stalin. He wanted joint control of the Dardanelles Strait, that waterway that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. It was a major choke point, and Stalin wanted in.
So it was a tense situation, to say the least.
Understatement. And then on March 12, 1947, Truman goes before Congress and lays it all out there.
Yeah.
He says, and this is the heart of the Truman Doctrine, it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Boom. There it is.
That's a powerful statement. I mean, it's basically saying the U.S. is not going to sit back and watch communism spread. We're going to step in and actively resist it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Containment. That becomes the name of the game. And it was a huge shift for U.S. foreign policy, because before this, they were all about staying out of other countries' business, especially in Europe. But now they're like, nope, we're drawing a line in the sand.
And they put their money where their mouth was, right? Congress approved $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey, military and economic aid, almost immediately.
Yeah, no messing around. And it made a difference. In Greece, the U.S. aid helped the government beat the communist rebels by 1949. And Turkey, with that U.S. backing, was able to stand up to Stalin and say, no way, we're not giving you control of the Dardanelles.
So that was the Truman Doctrine in action right there. Its first real test.
Absolutely. And it set a precedent. You could see the echoes of the Truman Doctrine in all kinds of U.S. actions throughout the Cold War, like the Korean War in the early 50s, for instance. That was all about containing communism, stopping it from spreading into South Korea.
Right, the U.S. leading the charge, basically. And what about Yugoslavia? Wasn't there something with them, too?
Oh, yeah, Yugoslavia. They were communist. But Tito, their leader, he had a falling out with Stalin. And the U.S. was like, hey, let's support Tito, keep him independent, keep the Soviets out of there. Again, containment.
So the Truman Doctrine was all about addressing those immediate threats, stopping communism from gaining ground right then and there. But there was this other massive problem in Europe that needed a different kind of solution. Western Europe's economy was in shambles.
Yeah, people were struggling. I mean, they were literally hungry. And George Marshall, he was Secretary of State at the time, he realized that if people are desperate enough, they'll turn to anyone who promises them a better life, even if that someone is, a communist regime.
Right. Communism can look pretty appealing when you're struggling to put food on the table. So Marshall comes up with this plan. He gives a speech at Harvard in June 1947, and he says something really interesting. He says, our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos.
Smart, right. He's framing it as this humanitarian effort not an attack on the Soviet Union. But everyone knew what was really going on.
So what was the Marshall Plan in a nutshell?
It was basically a massive aid package for Western Europe. The official name was the European Recovery Program, and it kicked off in April 1948. We're talking about over $13 billion, which is like $150 billion in today's money.
Wow, that's a lot of dough.
It was a huge investment. And it wasn't just the U.S. writing a check. 16 European nations were involved, and they actually formed this organization, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, to coordinate everything.
So it was a team effort, not just the U.S. calling all the shots.
Exactly. And it wasn't just cash either. It was grants, loans, machinery, food, technical assistance, all kinds of stuff to help these countries rebuild their economies from the ground up. And you can see the impact of the Marshall Plan all over Europe. I mean, look at France. They used Marshall Plan money to rebuild their transportation infrastructure, things like their railroads and the port of Marseille, which had been really badly damaged during the war. And by 1952, their industrial production was up by a third compared to before the war.
That's impressive. And what about Germany? They were hit pretty hard, too.
Yeah, Germany was in rough shape. But the Marshall Plan pumped about $1.4 billion into their economy. A lot of that went towards modernizing the Ruhr Valley coal industry, which was the backbone of their industrial sector. And that investment helped lay the foundation for what became known as the economic miracle in Germany.
The Wirtschaftswunder.
Yeah, that's the one. And then you've got Italy. They got about $1.5 billion from the Marshall Plan, and they used it to build new highways, modernize their steel industry, and expand their hydroelectric power generation.
So they were basically upgrading their entire infrastructure.
Pretty much. And even smaller countries, like the Netherlands, benefited from the Marshall Plan. They used the money they received to rebuild their flood control systems, which were super important for them because they're so low-lying, and to revitalize their agriculture.
So the Marshall Plan was really about getting these economies back on their feet, right? And it seemed like it did a pretty good job of that.
It really did.
Yeah.
But it was more than just about economic recovery. It was about preventing the spread of communism by making those countries more stable and prosperous.
Right. Because if people are doing okay economically, they're less likely to be drawn to radical ideologies.
Mm.
And the Marshall Plan also had this really interesting side effect.
Oh, yeah, totally did.
Yeah.
Because all these European countries had to work together to figure out how to use the Marshall Plan money effectively. It actually pushed them towards greater economic cooperation.
Well, they had to put their heads together and come up with a plan, right?
Exactly. And that led to the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, which is kind of a precursor to the European Union.
So the Marshall Plan wasn't just about rebuilding economies. It was about building a new kind of Europe, a more unified Europe.
Totally. It was a really big deal.
So you've got the Truman Doctrine, which is about providing security and containing communism through military means. And you've got the Marshall Plan, which is about promoting economic recovery and stability. They really work hand in hand, don't they?
They do. They're like two sides of the same coin. The Truman Doctrine creates the stability that allows the Marshall Plan to succeed. And the Marshall Plan's success makes Western Europe less susceptible to communist influence.
It's like a 1-2 punch against communism.
Exactly. And together, they really solidify the U.S.'s role as the leader of the free world, and they help to create the division of Europe that we know as the Iron Curtain.
So how did the Soviets react to all of this? They must have been pretty ticked off.
Oh, they were furious. Stalin saw the Marshall Plan as this American scheme to take over Europe, to make it all dependent on the U.S. So he forbade any of the Eastern Bloc countries from participating, even though they desperately needed the help.
That's got to be frustrating for those countries.
Totally. And Stalin didn't stop there. He set up the Commonform in 1947, which is basically this organization to control the communist parties in Eastern Europe. And then, in 1949, he created Comecon, which was supposed to be the Soviet answer to the Marshall Plan, but it never really took off.
So the Soviets were trying to create their own version of a unified Europe, but under their control.
Exactly. And they also started cracking down even harder on dissent in Eastern Europe. A really stark example of this was the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948, where the communists, backed by the Soviets, just took over the government.
That must have sent shockwaves through the West.
It totally did. It was a wake-up call.
So when did all of this come to an end? Did the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan have official end dates?
Well, the Truman Doctrine was more of a guiding principle than a specific policy. The aid to Greece and Turkey ended pretty quickly, but the idea of containing communism shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades. So it didn't really have a formal end. It just kind of morphed and adapted over time.
Okay, that makes sense. And the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan officially wrapped up in 1951. By then, Western Europe was back on its feet economically. Many of the countries that had received aid were actually doing better than they were before the war. So the Marshall Plan was considered a big success.
So what's the legacy of these two policies? How do we understand their impact today?
They had a profound and lasting impact on the world. I mean, they solidified the division of Europe. They established the U.S. as the global superpower. They showed that economic aid could be a really powerful tool of foreign policy, and they defined the terms of the Cold War. It's a pretty huge legacy.
And there's been some debate over the years about whether they were the right moves.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some historians have argued that the U.S. overreacted to the Soviet threat, and that the Truman Doctrine's emphasis on military containment actually made the Cold War worse. Others have questioned whether the Marshall Plan was really as altruistic as it seemed, or whether it was just a way for the U.S. to gain control over Europe. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
So even though these policies were enacted decades ago, they're still relevant today, aren't they? We're still grappling with a lot of the same issues. How to deal with global powers, how to use aid effectively, how to promote democracy and freedom around the world.
Absolutely. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan were products of their time, but they also raised these timeless questions about power, ideology, and the role of the U.S. in the world. It's a conversation that we're still having today.
And speaking of conversations, if you're interested in learning more about the Cold War, our next deep dive will be on the Berlin Blockade and Airlift, which happened in 1948 and 1949. It was a direct result of the tensions we've been talking about today, and it's a fascinating story of how the U.S. and the Soviets faced off in a divided city.
Yeah, that's a good one. It really shows how high the stakes were during the Cold War.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.